For centuries, sailors who braved the danger of the high seas dreamed of a vessel that wasn't vulnerable to the whims of nature, one that could slip underwater in stormy weather and resurface again in more favorable conditions. Naval commanders envisioned warships that could hide beneath the waves and attack unsuspecting ships. In the mid-19th century, the first successful hand-propelled submarines began working with the Navy, and from beneath the sea, an entirely new form of warfare emerged. These men are preparing to put the most sophisticated undersea weapon of its kind out to sea. The USS Jefferson City is one of the U.S. Navy's newest class of nuclear-powered attack submarines. Although she has been in service less than 2 months, her crew has drilled together for 2 years. The men aboard are among the brightest and most capable individuals serving in the Navy. Each one is a volunteer. Each one has chosen the silent service. Their families don't know where they're going or when they will return. When they do come back, they won't talk about where they've been or what they did.
Quartermaster shifting, red yellow sounding is red, 12 feet, yellow, 14 feet.
The 138 men aboard know their wartime mission: to hunt down and destroy enemy ships and submarines. But they've also learned a new mission for this modified submarine. In its bow, 12 Tomahawk cruise missiles stand ready to attack any land target within 1,600 miles. While Allied offensive operations received much fanfare in the 1991 Persian Gulf War, little attention was paid to U.S. submarine operations in the surrounding oceans. Then the Navy quietly announced the USS Louisville had fired a Tomahawk cruise missile into Iraq while it was submerged in the Red Sea. For the first time in 45 years, a U.S. submarine fired its weapons in combat.
I think what it proved was the compatibility of a submarine to work with other forces and could provide a clandestine, a covert manner for launching and delivering ordnance against a target.
With the stealth and survivability of a submarine platform, the Tomahawks have an even greater chance to be used covertly in a first strike scenario, to seize the initiative with a precise application of force. Aboard the Jefferson City, the crew prepares to dive into the ominous black world of inner space. As they disappear, they join a long and proud line of men who have braved the depths and conditions of life under the sea. Today's modern submarines bear no resemblance to their ancestors. For centuries, inventive minds had wrestled with one design after another, trying to perfect a reliable undersea boat. The most promising models came late in the 19th century, as electric motors and storage batteries created a reliable underwater power plant. When Robert Whitehead invented his self-propelled torpedo in 1868, military strategists saw the potential of a standoff submersible attack ship. By the end of the century, these torpedo boats sailed under the flags of 6 nations.
At that time, most ships were heavily armored, big-gunned surface ships, battleships, the dreadnoughts. It was the submarine that was quiet and unconventional, and almost it was unfashionable to have it. It's rather like naval aviation. There's a good parallel there. It was taken up almost as a sport by the British and by the Germans in particular, but also other nations were getting interested, the Americans, the Japanese, and the Italians.
The U.S. Navy paid $150,000 for its first submarine, the USS Holland, in 1900. Powered by a 45-horsepower gasoline engine, the Holland had 3 small ballast tanks designed to fill with water and let her dive. More important to the Navy were the 3 torpedoes she carried in her bow. The Holland ran her gas engine above surface and switched to electric motors when she dived. In the years to follow, larger, faster boats emerged, sporting periscopes, deck guns, and diesel power plants. But in the eyes of many naval officers, they were little more than toys built to keep up with other navies. In those days, sailors referred to submarines as pig boats.
The submarine stank from diesel oil, from garbage, from crew perspiration. There was no air conditioning. They would keep the hatches closed, buttoned up for maybe 3, 4, 5 hours at a time as they operated submerged. That used to be able to say that you could spot a submarine sailor in a crowd just because of the stench from the diesel oil.
It was halfway around the world where submarines had their most loyal enthusiasts. By 1914, the German High Command had built 29 Untersee boats and had plans for hundreds more. The subs, called U-boats, carried a crew of 35 men.
You couldn't really call it a submarine because it really wasn't an undersea boat. It was more a submersible. In other words, it was designed to cruise on the surface and only dive in the event of danger or to attack a target.
When war broke out in Europe, most observers anticipated a bloody confrontation between the German and British navies, but each side held their warships back, preferring initially to blockade each other's harbors. Within weeks, the U-boats were out on missions throughout the Atlantic. Armed with powerful radio receivers, they counted on secret agents around the world to transmit the location of cargo ships bound for England.
When they spotted the smoke from a convoy or a merchant ship, the submarine would race at high speed until they could identify what kind of a target it was. Once the U-boat identified the target, its direction, its general speed, then the submarine would submerge. Underwater, at a speed of 5 or 6 knots, it could only travel for about an hour. It would then line up, using its periscope, line up the torpedo shot, fire, depending upon the size of the target, the importance, 1, 2, 3, maybe even 4 torpedoes.
In September of 1914, a lone U-boat came upon 3 British light cruisers off the coast of Holland. The sub's crew fired 5 torpedoes. In less than an hour, all 3 British ships were at the bottom, taking with them the lives of 1,400 men. The attack shocked the British Admiralty, most of whom had felt submarine warfare was sneaky and uncivilized.
Basically, submarines had a good tactical success in the war, in that people were scared of them. The British Grand Fleet rarely put to sea. It wasn't thought that a submarine could sink one of their mighty battleships, but they were still concerned about it.
But no other sinking aroused world opinion as much as the passenger liner Lusitania. The pride of England, she was the largest transcontinental ship of her time. The Lusitania was returning from the United States, and just off the coast of Ireland when she crossed the path of U-boat 20. Low on fuel, with only 3 torpedoes on board, U-20 was headed home. Upon sighting the liner, U-20's commander fired 1 torpedo. In just 18 minutes, the Lusitania slipped beneath the surface, along with 1,200 passengers, 128 of them Americans.
The Lusitania incident, which is credited by many people as being the single most important incident in bringing the United States into the First World War, bolstered the morale of the German submarine service. It also made the Royal Navy sit up and think about anti-submarine warfare operations and made them develop those, particularly the use of surface ships and aircraft.
International outrage forced the Germans to adhere to rules of restricted warfare. The regulations, dating back to the 16th century, required attackers to grant safe passage to cargo crews before sinking their ships. war went on, German admirals saw their sink-on-sight tactics as the only way to stem the flow of supplies to the Allies, and the sinkings continued. The Americans committed to war on paper in 1917, but placing troops on European soil was far more difficult. To pass through the sub-ridden Atlantic Passage, they adapted a system of convoy escorts to accompany all passenger and cargo ships bound for the Western Front.
Once we entered, ironically, our major contribution to the war with Britain was our anti-submarine destroyers. Our ability to go after German U-boats, to reinforce the British Navy, which was very tired after almost 3 years of war, to reinforce them with a large number of destroyers for anti-submarine warfare.
With U.S. warships alongside the convoys, the U-boats tended to stay under rather than trade shells with the large surface ships. Since they used their deck guns for most of their kills, the U-boats lost their most reliable weapon. New anti-submarine warfare tactics began to take their toll on the U-boats as well. Escort planes carried recoilless rifles from above, while depth charges ripped into their hulls from below. The hunter had become the hunted. The U-boat losses were staggering. By the end of the war, 178 were sent to the bottom, including 5,000 officers and men. Although they were badly beaten in the First World War, the U-boats still posted an impressive combat record. Over 5,000 ships sunk, including 350 warships of the Royal Navy. Britain called for submarines to be banned, along with gas warfare, at the 1921 Naval Disarmament Conference. However, the U.S. pressed for their continued development.
The U.S. naval design of submarines at the beginning of the interwar period went down the route of domination of the Pacific Ocean fleet commanders' views. In other words, they wanted to have a cruiser-type submarine capable of very long patrols, most of which would be on the surface, diving only to attack targets.
In the 20s, the U.S. R boats and S boats were the pride of the Navy submarine force. But the S boats lacked the endurance to operate over long distances in the Pacific. Diesel-carrying tender ships helped, but they were so large they exposed the sub to air attack. Seaplanes were introduced to extend their operational range, but they slowed the S-boats even more. The Navy's answer was the V-boat. Launched in the late 1920s, they were more than twice the size of the S-boats. They mounted 2 6-inch guns on their decks. Still, the V-boat's enormous size was its weakness. They were unable to submerge quickly and became easy targets for airplanes. Engineers began working on a new submarine. They also improved the torpedoes.
In the interwar years, considerable research was done to try and extend the range, reliability, and hitting power of submarine torpedoes. A lot of work had been carried out to develop different forms of detonator, using the magnetic signature of ships to set them off, to use the noise of ships' propellers to set them off, as well as the contact fuse. But what we didn't have was any real advantage or any real advance on the compressed air system.
Torpedo design was universal throughout the world. Inside, a tank of compressed air was rigged up to 2 propellers in the rear. When launched, the air spun the propellers in opposite directions to keep the torpedo on course. Unfortunately, the releasing air created a bubble path and gave the submarine's location away. Other concerns were for saving crewmen trapped in a crippled sub. In 1929, the Navy engineered the Momsen lung, a device to carry pressurized air. Inside a newly designed escape chamber, seawater was allowed in to a pressure equal to the depth outside. By controlling their breathing and rate of ascent to the surface, the submariners finally had a workable means of escape. The Japanese were also building up their naval service, but their submarine force was considered secondary to their surface fleet.
Despite its proximity to the Pacific Ocean, Japan saw the submarine as a coastal defense tool rather than being any strategic importance in any offensive system. It paid for that type of thinking when the Pacific War came in the 1940s, and it came up against a much superior American force.
After 20 years of development in secrecy, Germany unveiled her newest U-boat class in 1936.
They developed a series of coastal and ocean-going U-boats. Coastal U-boats to protect their own harbors and their own ships, ocean-going to take the war to the enemy off its shore and raid its merchant ships, which it perceived to be particularly vulnerable.
German Navy Admiral Karl Dönitz, a former World War I submariner, led a new generation of U-boat crews. Drawing on lessons he learned in the First War, Dönitz developed the strategy of the wolf pack, where several U-boats would attack convoys simultaneously in a coordinated effort. Sooner than Dönitz realized, he would have to put these war plans to work. Elsewhere, submarine warfare was perceived in a different light.
In the 20s and 30s, the US Navy, the Japanese Navy, to some degree the British Navy, developed submarines with the idea that they would be used to scout ahead of the battle fleet, to give warning to the battle fleet of an approaching enemy fleet, and then to start attacking the enemy ships to reduce the number of warships that would be attacking our warships in the classic battle.
By the late 1930s, the U.S. Navy settled on the 𝒂𝒂𝒑𝒐𝒏𝒔 submarine for large-scale production.
The fleet boats at that time were 310 feet long, 27-foot beam. They carried usually around 90 people, 60 to 70 enlisted men and 8 to 10 officers. We had 2 torpedo rooms. We had 24 torpedoes, 16 forward and 8 aft. The new boats at that time had a 5-inch 25 deck gun, and they also had a 40 millimeter and a 20 millimeter. So for a submarine, you had quite a bit of actual firepower above.
It was capable of extended patrols of up to a month. It needed refueling from time to time, but that was the same fuel used by surface ships, so it could rendezvous with a surface ship and take on fuel. Really, the endurance was limited to that of the amount of diesel that was available, the amount of fresh water available, and the capability of the crew of standing a rather nerve-wracking operation.
Soon the Americans and Germans would put their best submarines to the test. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, they all but crippled the offensive striking power of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. That same day, the Chief of Naval Operations telegraphed a one-sentence order to the fleet at Pearl: execute unrestricted submarine warfare against Japan.
Japan, during the Battle of the Pacific, required natural resources to come in from its captured territories in Indochina, Indonesia, and the Pacific Islands. The United States realized that a strategic attack on those resources would start to bring Japan to its knees.
51 fleet subs were given the task of interdicting Japanese shipping. Only volunteers were allowed on board. Anytime a crew member wanted to leave the submarine, his request was granted, no questions asked. One by one, they left the island of Oahu, only to pair up later in packs of 3.
This first patrol that I went out on, the boat was painted sort of like camouflage in a light blue and gray. And when you saw that, you knew that we were going to go into a shallow water area. And we did. We went up into the LOC.
We had a whole series of patrol areas. Areas divided up for a particular submarine or a particular wolfpack that concentrated on these areas where the traffic most likely had to move. There was essentially no commercial traffic outside of Japanese ships in those areas. There wasn't any commercial traffic, say a British ship or another independent commercial ship. Essentially every target was an enemy target.
The average mission of a fleet-class submarine required it to carry 16 or 18 torpedoes. It had a range of about 12,000 to 14,000 yards at a speed of about 30 knots. So it made it capable of outrunning most ships. But its range was relatively limited, and it had no maneuverability as we know it today. It was free running, straight to a target.
By the summer of 1942, fleet subs were outfitted with surface radar, giving them eyes to determine the range and bearing of enemy ships. For 18 months, subs were the only U.S. ships to penetrate enemy sea lanes.
We had two types of attack, fundamentally two types of attack. We had night service attacks on the surface, and we had a daylight attack and sometimes night attack from a submerged position. We would be looking for targets, tracking with radar and so forth, picking up targets as far distant as we could, then closing in, getting as close to the escorts as we could, getting inside the escorts, if possible, in an escorted convoy, and making attacks both with stern tubes and bow tubes on the surface amongst the convoy itself. Some of those were very, very successful. During the war, you gained experience very, very rapidly. The entire ship learned fast, and you became a very seasoned, combat-capable individual in very short order.
But patrols close to enemy shores often brought a quick response from Japanese destroyers and anti-submarine aircraft.
We'd be laying down there, say 400 feet, and you'd hear this little noise, and then you'd hear the explosion. And it's like being inside of a big drum and somebody beating on the outside of it with a hammer, you know. It's just a loud noise. And if you take, you know, 200 or 300 of these or 60 of these things, you know, you've taken a lot of punishment. There were several times after this was over with and we'd been down all day and you couldn't even light a cigarette. It wouldn't stay lit. You couldn't light a match. That's how bad the air got.
In September 1943, a new electric torpedo was introduced that didn't leave a wake behind it. Still, given the choice, many fleet boat skippers preferred the faster compressed air torpedoes. The fleet boats were always on call for lifeguard duty. At one time, 22 subs were committed solely for the purpose of rescuing downed airmen. Over 500 Army, Navy, and Marine aviator pilots were saved. Among them was a young Navy pilot, George Bush. Those who didn't survive were given burial at sea. Although submarines comprised less than 2% of the U.S. Navy's entire fleet, by the end of the war, they were responsible for 65% of all Japanese ships sunk. But that success came with a price. 1 out of every 4 submarines that left never came back. When Britain declared war on Germany in 1939, their navies returned to the same seas where they fought 25 years earlier. The fight for the Atlantic would be the longest battle of the war. The United States began exporting massive amounts of weapons and ammunition abroad under the Lend-Lease Act of 1941. Again, as in the First World War, cargo ships had to cross the Atlantic, where the U-boats were waiting. Like the Americans in the Pacific, the Germans divided the Atlantic Ocean into sectors, assigning boats to specific patrol areas.
On the surface, there were 4 men on the conning tower. Each had a sector of 90 degrees. And he scanned the horizon back and forth as soon as he saw smoke on the horizon. Then we knew that we were close to a convoy, and we couldn't go any closer.
Upon spotting a cargo ship, the crew would radio its position to the Unterseeboot headquarters in France. The closest subs in the area were then sent to rendezvous with the first U-boat.
And after dusk, then we closed in, always on the surface. And we went in front of the convoy stopped there and sunk into the upcoming convoy. A convoy is usually of 50 or 60 freighters, and they run in 4, 5, 6 lines next to each other. So we run in the middle of the line, shot the front torpedoes in a fan, 3 or 4 torpedoes, several targets, and the aft torpedo also into the other line. We very seldom took a military a cruiser or a destroyer because we were fighting war material, foodstuff, and every freighter was more important than a cruiser.
The Wolf-Pack attacks were initially successful, but history began to repeat itself, and Allied countermeasures began to take their toll. B-24 Liberators forced the U-boats underwater until they either surfaced or sank. Destroyers carried new sonar equipment that picked up the sound of the submerged U-boat propellers. Armed with depth charges, they guessed the U-boat's depth and set the charges to explode above and beneath them.
When he dropped his depth charge, the splash of the depth charge we heard in the boat. And then we counted and waited when they exploded. And that was terrible. That was terrible. Because you sit there completely defenseless. You cannot do a thing about it. You have only to pray and to hope that the depth charge won't hit.
The U-boats countered late in the war with a snorkel device that allowed them to run their diesel engines underwater. However, this also had the effect of keeping them under longer, and their effectiveness was lost. In the closing days of the war, the U-boat crews had only one chance in 10 of surviving a patrol. By the time Admiral Dönitz surrendered to Allied forces, only 7,000 crewmen had survived from an original U-boat force of 39,000. In the Mediterranean, British submarine operations concentrated heavily on German cargo ships, successfully interdicting German supplies bound for Rommel's Africa Corps. By the end of the war, 80% of all ships lost on either side were destroyed by submarines. Throughout the Second World War, submarines proved themselves to be formidable weapons, but they had limitations. Rarely could a submarine stay submerged for more than 20 hours. Scientists and engineers on both sides had labored to devise an engine that could power the submarines for days without the need to surface. The greatest single breakthrough in propulsion systems came in July of 1945. Out of the bursting core of the invisible atom, scientists released a source of energy surpassing anything ever imagined. Since nuclear fission is non-combustible and needs no oxygen to release energy, its potential as a submarine power plant was irresistible. Under Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, Navy Captain Hyman Rickover undertook a 7-year project to build the first nuclear-powered submarine.
After World War II, the United States had the only major navy in existence. So we had a situation where we had a large, highly capable, well-trained submarine force and no enemy to go after with it. In that period, we see a lot of innovation in U.S. submarine ideas.
In 1947, the first guided missile was launched off the deck of a submarine. Subs were outfitted in 1953 with airtight hangars to carry another guided missile, the Regulus. The nuclear warhead, Regulus had a range of 500 miles and cruised at the speed of sound. The USS Perch carried helicopters for surveillance and special operations. In the Korean War, Perch put a party of British commandos ashore for destruction of a railroad bridge. With just one casualty, the crew returned to the Perch and slipped back into the ocean. Another mission for submarines was air defense. Radar picket boats far off the coast maintained a round-the-clock watch for a surprise air attack throughout the 1950s. The first attack subs carried huge sonar sections to listen for and track other submarines. By 1954, Admiral Rickover's team had succeeded in building the Nautilus, the first submarine to be outfitted with a nuclear engine.
Suddenly, instead of a submarine doing 10 knots for an hour underwater, it can do 10 knots for a year underwater. It can do 20 knots for a year or 30 knots for a year. With a diesel-electric submarine, doing 25 knots will deplete your battery in a few minutes. The submarine, for the first time, becomes a true underwater vehicle. Not a surface ship that submerges for certain periods of time, but a true underwater vehicle.
The Nautilus was fitted with a carbon dioxide scrubber to purify the oxygen aboard. With a water purification system, its range was limited only by the endurance of its crew. In 1956, the Nautilus cruised 50,000 miles without refueling.
With the advent of nuclear power, there was no longer the need to have hull shapes which allowed them to cruise at speed on the surface. The teardrop hull appeared, its double pressure hull for deep diving. It had this totally new look, not dissimilar from a whale, which after all spends most of its time underwater.
In the 1950s, the US wasn't the only superpower interested in submarines. The Soviet Union embarked on its own nuclear navy buildup. By 1961, she would have more submarines than all other countries combined. In 1957, she shocked the world with the launch of the first satellite.
The firing of Sputnik and the Russians putting Sputnik in space was such a surprise and caught us off guard scientifically. We wanted to do something as advanced. The Nautilus in being was an opportunity for us to prove that we were there.
The US Navy were very keen to prove that nuclear-powered submarines had a strategic role. They took the Nautilus under the ice to the North Pole, not only to give their own crews inspiration, but also to indicate to the Soviet Union that they were capable of operations on Russia's doorstep.
On August 3rd, 1958, Nautilus crossed the center of the North Pole. It was the first vessel and the largest group of men ever assembled there. Born at the height of the Cold War, the water-launched nuclear missile gave the submarine an entirely new mission: nuclear deterrence.
The submarine is the ideal vehicle for an independent nuclear deterrent. Once you've developed a rocket that can carry a nuclear warhead and launch it from underwater, you can place it in a submarine and you can more or less hide that submarine anywhere in what is effectively 4/5 of the world's surface.
The Polaris was the first missile designed for this role. It initially had a range of 1,300 miles.
Two things happened to make the Polaris missile feasible. First of all, we developed a solid propellant. Liquid propellant was too unstable to even think of for a submarine. Then we developed a miniature nuclear warhead, so that combination of a solid propellant with a miniaturized warhead permitted us to put the Polaris missile together in such a form that we could carry it without any problem in a submarine hull.
The atomic-powered Polaris subs presented a new challenge to their crews. They could operate longer than it was practical to keep men out to sea. The blue and gold rotating crew concept allowed the Polaris subs to operate with little interruption.
The normal patrol was for 60 days. Submarine would then come into port alongside a tender. The crew would leave the submarine and a second crew would take over. They'd have about a week or 2 weeks turnover, replenishing the submarine, repairing any items that went down on the 60-day patrol. Then the second crew would take the submarine out for another 60-day nuclear deterrent patrol.
Eventually, 41 Polaris missile submarines were built, each carrying the destructive power to wipe out several Russian cities and military targets, if so ordered by the president. Their mission was to slip into the ocean at first chance and disappear for 60 days or more.
We were required to always be in communications in the sense that we could always hear the radio signal from the command headquarters. And we had a trailing wire and a buoy that we could trail, which meant you had to patrol at relatively shallow depths. Headquarters would send the drill launch signal called a weapon systems readiness test signal, day or night, and when you go to battle stations and you would go through a full countdown, the only thing you would not do is open the missile out of doors or take it to the last stage.
They were among the first weapons of deterrence, built with the intent of never being used. A successful patrol meant returning with all 16 missiles intact. In the 60s, attack submarines came of age. With smaller, improved sonar systems, the 𝒔𝒄𝒔𝒂𝒑𝒐𝒏𝒔 class was able to extend naval power into enemy waters, where air and surface forces wouldn't dream of going. Armed with Subrock, a rocket-powered nuclear depth charge, an attack submarine had the capability of reaching another submarine 30 miles away. In 1976, the first of the Los Angeles-class attack subs were launched.
The best weapon to attack another submarine with is a submarine. America developed the Los Angeles-class nuclear-propelled attack submarine to do just that, to attack marauding Victor and Dekula-class Soviet submarines, but also to penetrate their bastions and to attack their own missile-carrying boats of the Typhoon class or the Delta class.
The improved Los Angeles-class attack sub's mission is to seek, not hide. At the heart of the ship is the sonar room. Here, underwater sounds are transcribed on screen for visual rather than auditory recognition. To receive messages, a towed antenna can be floated to the surface, or the sub itself can surface and raise its antenna. Low-frequency transmissions relay everything from enemy ship locations to the latest sports reports.
Some of the best officers and crews in the US Navy man these Los Angeles-class boats. They are equipped with the latest technology in terms of computers and in weapon systems.
The Mark 48 is the Navy's premier attack torpedo.
Technology in terms of torpedoes and other weapons has moved on apace since the Second World War. The first step was to develop wire guidance, some 30,000 yards of wire, which would allow a submarine to be maneuvered by the torpedo officer to an attacking position.
We can program the torpedo a little bit. We can tell it how fast to go, how deep to search for it, look at what angle, how far out to go before it turns on and goes active. We control all those things.
Homing heads provide an active system which allows a torpedo to sniff out the weak spots in an enemy's hull and go for the weakest point. It recognizes the target and from its own data bank can select the weak point to go for. It knows, for example, where the hatches are, and those are going to be the weakest point in the pressure hull of the enemy submarine.
In 1982, the Ohio-class nuclear deterrence submarine was introduced as the older Polaris submarines were phased out. Their size is enormous. At 560 feet, they are almost the length of 2 football fields. Hidden, mobile, and ready, the Ohio-class carries 24 Trident missiles in its hull. Each Trident has a range of more than 4,000 miles and carries up to 8 independently targetable warheads.
The Trident boats have a complement of 155 men on board. They not only have their own defensive systems of torpedoes, but they also have a very complex and very sophisticated sonar suite, which enables them to lay undetected and keep out of harm's way. Their 65 to 70-day mission involves patrolling, probably in the North Atlantic and the Arctic Ocean, within range of the former Soviet Union or other targets which the United States government considers to be worthy of such nuclear deterrence. Their aim is to remain there undetected for that length of patrol time and come back.
But no matter how advanced the systems and electronics have become, it is the 20-year-old men who must run them. Today's submariners are entrusted with equipment and responsibility that was unimaginable 20 years ago.
Clearly, we're looking for people who have technical knowledge and certainly have the ability to learn. We're looking for people who want to succeed and have a desire to improve themselves, because this business is one of an individual moving up. We don't have a situation where a person can establish a quiescent level of performance. I mean, in our business, you're either going up or you're going down, and we want our folks going up.
Submariners are quick to remind you that in their environment, they not only need to operate their electronic systems, but they have to know how to repair them as well. Under the sea, they have only themselves to rely upon to keep the sub mission ready. Additionally, they have to learn to handle every other system in the ship in the event that they are near that piece of equipment during an emergency situation. It takes most men the better part of a year on board before they earn the coveted dolphins. Like wings to a pilot, they are the mark of pride, professionalism, and above all, sacrifice.
Congratulations and welcome.
The young officers, the young men who serve on submarines do give up a lot. They find themselves operating isolated in many cases from their families for long periods of time. They find themselves in a circumstance where they are giving a tremendous amount to this nation. I would certainly take my hat off to every one of our submariners, and I can tell you that we are certainly getting a very, very excellent group of young men into the force today, and we look on continuing that same tremendous record of performance that has typified and characterized submarines in the past 35 to 40 years, and I'm sure will go on well into the next century.
Even with its role as a standoff weapon validated in the Gulf War, many still question the future need for a submarine force. But they have only to be reminded that today submarines are sailing under the flags of 43 countries. With its cruise missiles, reliable communications, and stealthy characteristics, the sub may be the best option for small-scale surprise attacks and special operations, and as such, remains an effective deterrent to war.